Third story, the Frost Watcher of Everglade. It was the night before New Year's Eve. I had just arrived in Everglade, a tiny village hidden deep within the forests of Maine. The air was sharp and freezing. Snow blanketed the ground in an unbroken white sheet. I was visiting my Uncle Jack, who had invited me to spend the holidays with him and his daughter, Lila. Uncle Jack's house was cozy but old, with creaking floors and windows that rattled in the wind. Lila, an 8-year-old with wild curls and curious eyes, was thrilled to have company. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, she told me about the Frost Watcher. They say he comes out when the temperature drops below 0. She whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. He looks like a man, but his skin is icy blue, and his eyes glow white in the dark. I laughed nervously, thinking it was just a local legend to scare kids. But Leela was serious. He hates noise. She continued, if you're too loud on his night, he takes you away into the forest and you never come back. That night, the wind howled outside, and the house felt eerily silent despite the crackling fire. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, guttural sound from the forest. At first, thought it was the wind, but then came a soft tap on the window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Lila was asleep upstairs, and Uncle Jack had retired to his room, summoning all my courage. I approached the window. There he was, standing in the snow just beyond the porch, the Frost Watcher. His skin was a sickly blue, and his eyes glowed like 2 white flames. He raised a long, bony finger and pointed at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and the sound seemed to anger him. He moved closer to the house, his movements unnatural, like he was gliding over the ground. I ran upstairs to Lila's room and shook her awake. We have to go, I whispered. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes and nodded. We woke Uncle Jack, and the 3 of us huddled in the basement, listening as the Frost Watcher circled the house, his fingers scraping against the walls. By morning, he was gone. But the snow outside was disturbed by long drag marks leading into the forest. Uncle Jack decided we should leave Everglade that day. As we drove away, I glanced back at the tree line. For a brief moment, I thought I saw those white flames watching us from the shadows. First story, the whispers of Frost Hollow. It was a snowy New Year's Eve when my Uncle Ethan invited me to his cabin in Frost Hollow, a remote village nestled deep in the forests of Maine. I was excited to spend time away from the city, but there was something about the place that felt off even before I arrived. The locals had warned me about a curse that supposedly plagued the area every New Year, but I shrugged it off as superstitious nonsense. When I got to the cabin, my 8-year-old cousin, Lila, ran to greet me. She was excited to show me the new sled she had gotten for Christmas, but my uncle seemed nervous. His eyes darted to the windows as if he was expecting someone or something. "Stay inside after sunset," he warned. And whatever you do, don't answer the whispering." That evening, as we gathered around the fireplace for dinner, a strange sound echoed from the woods. It was like a chorus of voices, soft and sing-song, beckoning with an almost hypnotic melody. Lila froze mid-bite, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here," she whispered. Uncle Ethan bolted the doors and drew the curtains. "Ignore it," he said, his voice shaking. "They can't come in unless you let them." But curiosity got the better of me. When everyone was asleep, I crept to the window and peered out. The forest was alive with movement, figures barely visible in the shimmering snow. They looked like people, but were too tall, too thin, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural blue light. One of them turned toward me as if it could feel my gaze. It smiled, revealing rows of sharp and icicle-like teeth. Soft voice carried through the air. "Come outside. Join us." Panicked, I backed away from the window, but the whispering grew louder. Leela appeared in the hallway, her eyes glazed over. She reached for the door, murmuring, "They want me to play." I grabbed her arm and shook her. "Leela, wake up." She snapped out of her trance just as the door rattled violently. The voices outside were no longer sweet. They were angry. Uncle Ethan rushed into the room, carrying a bundle of dried herbs and a lighter. He lit the herbs and waved them around the door. The smell was overwhelming, and the whispering faded into a distant hum. "That was too close," he said, his face pale. "They almost took her." The rest of the night was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were still watching. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left Frost Hollow. I never asked Uncle Ethan about the curse again, but every New Year's Eve, I hear the faint whispers in my dreams, and I pray they don't find me again. Second story, The Frost of Silent Pines. It was a frigid New Year's Eve in the small town of Silent Pines, nestled deep in the forests of Maine. The town was known for its heavy snowfalls and eerie winter nights. I had decided to spend the holiday weekend with my niece Emily. Bright 7-year-old with a love for stories and an unshakable curiosity. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by a dense ring of pine trees that seemed to whisper when the wind passed through. The locals had warned me to stay indoors after dark and to never venture into the woods alone on New Year's Eve. They spoke of the Frost Warden, a creature that only appeared when the clock struck midnight to collect those lost in the cold. Emily was already asleep upstairs when the power went out. I lit a few candles and sat by the fireplace, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. The snow outside was falling heavily, blanketing everything in a deafening silence. Then, a knock on the door broke the stillness. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. 3 slow and deliberate knocks. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, only to find nothing but an unbroken sheet of snow. Closed the door. I noticed a set of small footprints leading towards the woods. My heart sank. Emily? I called, running upstairs to her room, but she was gone. The window was open, letting in an icy gust of wind. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbing a lantern before following the footprints into the forest. The trees loomed over me like silent giants as I called her name. The footprints led deeper into the woods, where the air grew colder and the darkness thicker. Then I saw her. Emily was standing in a small clearing, her back to me, staring at something I couldn't see. "Emily, come back!" I yelled, but she didn't move as I stepped closer. I noticed that the air around her seemed to freeze, the ground covered in a thin layer of crystalline ice. And then I saw it. The frost warden was tall, its form humanoid, but its skin a pale, translucent blue, like frosted glass. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its long fingers curled towards Emily like icicles reaching for the sun. "Stay away from her," I shouted, stepping between them. The creature tilted its head, and for a moment, it seemed to study me. Then it spoke, its voice a low, rumbling whisper. "She called me. She is mine." "No, she's not," I said. Holding Emily close, the frost warden reached out. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, it let out an unearthly screech and dissipated into the morning mist. Emily woke up in my arms, her memory of the night blissfully blank. But as we walked back to the cabin, I noticed something in the snow behind us. A single set of footprints leading back into the forest,